We are co-creating the world, which means we are not alone in the world, which means that there are other things that are offering us support. And what does it look like to give appreciation and gratitude for the other things that are offering us support? That to me is such a fundamental, foundational aspect of a spiritual practice. Because spirituality acknowledges that we're not here doing this by ourselves. It flies in the face of individualism. It can be hard in the midst of so much violence, oppression, and despair to believe in a just, loving, and compassionate world. I'm also clear that if ever we need a collective hold of that possibility, it is now. Mundane Miracles with Sonya Renee Taylor is a podcast where I share stories, reflections, anecdotes, and epiphanies from my daily existence in an effort to collect evidence that life is truly loving and kind, full of intention, guiding us all toward greater love, grace, and compassion, proving that if we learn to look and listen, we will hear and see that life is indeed unfolding for our highest good. Join me as I share evidence that life is happening on purpose with radical love in service of our highest good, even when it sucks, especially when it sucks.
When I let my grief take up all the space of 1,000 oceans that were washing over me every day, I have to say, I felt joy, oh boy, I felt unexpected, unusual, surprising waves of joy.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of Mundane Miracles with Sonya Renee Taylor, the podcast where we collect evidence that life is indeed happening on purpose with radical love in service of our highest good, even when it sucks, especially when it sucks. And I am your ever humble and grateful host, Sonya Renee Taylor. Hi, folks. Welcome back. I am so glad to be with you again. I love that I'm often recording this podcast from all kinds of various places around the world. That feels important. It feels like it is part of what we're doing, is like collecting evidence from around the world. Like these experiences are happening in all these different places. My last episode was in La Ceja, Colombia. And this episode is coming to you from Palma de Mallorca, Spain. And it's likely that my next episode may be coming from either California or Toronto or Durham, North Carolina. And then you'll get a couple of episodes maybe from Tanzania and Kenya. So yay, I am out in these streets, these global streets, collecting evidence that life is happening on purpose with radical love in service of our highest good. Even when it sucks, especially when it sucks. So this is a listener requested episode after our last episode where I talked about my journey with Grandmother Yahe and shared that the medicine had told me that I didn't really need to be doing that medicine to get the information and wisdom that it was offering, because there were all sorts of modalities that I was already engaged in that was going to help me get there, and that I could take the slower, less intense road, that might actually help me. And so what a gift, what a gift, what a gift. One of the listeners asked me, Sonya, what are your practices and how did they come into being? And I was like, well, that sounds like a perfect episode. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how did I develop a spiritual practice and what does that include? And how am I learning to listen to what life is asking me to do to be in greater alignment with what my soul's assignment is? So the first thing I want to say is that I am predisposed to ritual and spiritual practice. I'm predisposed because I'm a Black American who was raised in the sort of cultural norms of Black America, which also included the church. And although my parents didn't go to church, we always went on Easter, Christmas, Easter. Easter was like the year when the heathens all went to church, and my parents were definitely heathens. They were just teenagers. They were young, 20-something, wilding out, party kids. And so we did go on Easter, and we got our little Easter outfits, and we were cute. But when I went to live with my grandmother, which started when I was 9, my grandmother was a good, saved Christian woman, as was her mother, my great-grandmother. I met a woman here today at the place I'm at in Mallorca, Spain, who smelled just like my great-grandma. Every time I smelled her, I was like, you smell like Josephine. You smell like Josie Bell Taylor. She really did. It was cool. And so I grew up with my grandma going to church, and she went to Shiloh Community Baptist Church. I found Shiloh Community Baptist Church to be about as boring as a church could be. It just was boring, y'all. I don't know what else to say. It was boring. Baptist church can be stiff. It can be reserved. I mean, it was my family's church for a long time. Like, my great grandma's name is on one of the pews. It's that kind of like very much our family's historical church. And they ain't never have the kind of spiritual drama that I was predisposed to by nature of my personality. And so I always felt a little just bored with the messages, bored with the preaching, bored with the music. Like, I was bored. When I was 12, I told my grandma that I didn't like her church. You know, it's funny, as I recount this story, I'm just like, I've always been who I am. If I don't like it, I'm probably going to say something. And so I told my grandma I didn't like her church. And then she said, well, you need to find a church, but you got to go to church. You don't have to go to my church, but you got to go to church. And there was a church across the street from my grandmother's house in this red brick building. Not a Catholic church, but like a Episcopal or a Methodist, one of them derivatives of the Catholic Church. They had a church sharing process. So there was a small little black church that met there after the other church, and it was called Missionary Temple Church of God in Christ. So I decided I was just going to go check out this church. Now, really, I was checking out this church because it was close. I was like, oh, wait a minute. I could go to church in my backyard. Why would I wake up early on a Sunday morning to go to a church that's boring when I could wake up later and then just go to the church that's literally out the back door? Because efficiency is my middle name. Because I'm a projector. So a little shout out to human design there. I went to this church, and it was small. You know, it's a little small family church. Pastor Jones, Leonard Jones, the whole Jones family went to this church. And then there was like a white woman named Sister Tess. And then there was a woman named Sister Linda and her 2 children. And they went to this church. But everybody else was kind of related. But what was true about this church is that the people sang and they fell out in worship and praise, and they wept and cried to the Lord, and they ran up and down in the aisles, and they were slain in the spirit. And I found all of it utterly intoxicating. I found the level of emotionality and drama and spiritual intensity so alluring. It wasn't just alluring because of the pomp and circumstance. Yes, that. But there was something so immersive. Like, whatever they were feeling it. And I was like, I want to feel that deeply about God. I want to feel like my heart is just split open in worship. I want to be immersed in this kind of love. Like, that felt incredible to me. And so I started going to this church, and I loved it. And I became very, very, very involved in church. I was on the youth ministry team. I was on the film ministry team. I did the announcements on Sundays. I was in the choir. I was on the youth ministry. Like, you name it, I did it. The first protest I ever went to was an anti-abortion protest in Washington, D.C. with my church. That's the first time I ever protested. And I think it's hilarious, the first time I ever marched in an action. Of course, I think that's hilarious because I absolutely went on to be a pro-choice activist for many years of my life, and women's reproductive justice activist for many, many decades after that. And I'm certain that Sister Naomi, my dear church grandmother, would never have imagined that I was going to do a full 180 and go in the complete opposite direction, but I did. And one of the things that I remember was this one time I was having a conversation with Sister Naomi, my church grandmother, the sister of my pastor, the one who just sort of took me in. Like, she saw something in me. She had a granddaughter close to my age named Nikki. Nikki and I became good friends. Nikki and I got into many shenanigans over the years. Different story for a different podcast. But Sister Naomi, it was just, she really sort of adopted me into her family, and it was very sweet. And we were having a conversation, And I was telling her that I believe, by this time I'm 16 or 17. And I'm like, I think there are lots of pathways to God. Like, I don't believe that people who, never heard it. And at this time, I remember in this conversation, I used the example of Hawaii. And in part because in my brain at that time, that was about as far as I could imagine people in Hawaii, which is funny because it's a state. But I was like, so if people were in Hawaii and they believe something different, like, because that's what they know, like no one's ever brought them anything else, they're going to hell, right? I was like, that seems absurd to me. And I was like, I think that each culture probably has its own pathway to God, and that there are lots of pathways to God depending on your culture. And Sister Naomi looked at me so incredulously and was like, you're sounding awfully new agey. And at the time, I didn't know what new agey meant. I was just like, I don't even know what that means, but okay, I guess so. I don't know. And really, what she was pointing out was that I had beliefs that didn't fit neatly into the doctrine of Christianity. But I did have a love for God and a love for whatever source it was, which I defined at the time as God and still do. Although my understanding and conceptualization of God is much larger. It's expansive. It is as expansive as that which we cannot know. But at the time, it was God and Jesus, but I never harmonized with the idea that people were just going to hell because they didn't believe how you believed. That part never made sense to me. But the part that devotion and ritual and a deep emotional connection to the spiritual was a beautiful gift and a thing that we should absolutely aspire to and want, that never left me. And I really appreciated the foundation of my good Pentecostal Church of God in Christ foundation that made me know intimately that I had a connection with God. And that while I did not keep the doctrine that I was taught and the rules and rigidities, the things that the humans made up, I didn't keep those. But what I did keep was a deep, sacred, ritualistic relationship with the divine that stayed with me. And so, so praying and fasting, I grew up doing those things. I grew up like writing youth sermons. And the first time I ever wrote a youth sermon, I wrote a sermon about love because that was always my orientation. No matter what, my orientation was that God is love. I felt that from the very beginning and it's never left me. And so anyway, that's my sort of foundation, which I think really set the stage for some of my practices, even though they've evolved and certainly now include things that I'm sure my church back then would tell me I'm going to hell for. I'm very clear that they do not align with those doctrines. And that's okay. Like I don't feel any kind of way about that. So fast forward, way fast, I started going to 12-step programs in 2002. And anybody who has followed me over the years, that you might know that I struggled with and navigated what I identified as sex and love addiction and compulsive behaviors around sexuality and compulsive relationship to romantic relations and romantic and sexual relationships. And I started going to 12-step programs in 2002. And, while 12-step programs do not have any specific religious doctrine attached to it, it does believe in God. The second step is I came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. I turned my will and my life over to God as I understood God. Right. And so there was a spiritual foundation in the 12-step programs, and people have all kinds of opinions about 12-step programs, and they work for who they work for and they don't work for who they don't work for. And that's fine because we are unique beings who have different paths. But I found it tremendously helpful. And what I loved about it, again, as a person who's oriented towards ritual, it was very ritualistic, in that there's a structure whose foundation was rooted in spiritual transformation as its primary modality for change. And I was like, yeah, that. And so I found myself with deep resonance with 12-step programs. I found myself with deep resonance around the ritual of prayer, that the serenity prayer was something I could say at any given time that would help me sort of reorient myself and surrender. If you don't know the serenity prayer, it's goes, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And literally, I could find myself in a position where I was uncertain and say that prayer, and it would help bring me clarity. And so I guess I'm naming the first location of my own spiritual practice as a practice of prayer. It's the first one I learned how to do, and it was the one that was most consistently woven into my life. I also grew up saying prayers at night. We grew up saying grace before dinner, and we grew up saying a prayer before bed, and we grew up saying, now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep, and if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Amen. So that was my prayer when I was a little girl. It's funny, I'm certain I haven't said that prayer since I was 7 years old. And then when I went to live with my grandma, we learned the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the power, the honor, the power, and the glory. Amen. And so I grew up saying prayers. Now, I didn't know what those meant. I didn't know what those meant. But I did know that there was ritual before bed, and that there was ritual before eating. And those things became a foundation for my spiritual practice that remain today, which is, how do I express gratitude to the divine for what it is that I receive? And how do I express gratitude at my rest for the day that I've had? And so what I would offer for those who do not come from a organized religious background is that the practice of gratitude in the form of prayer is a profound gateway into spiritual practice. It is so easy. It doesn't have to be attached to God. It doesn't have to be attached to anything. It can be attached to simply, I am in gratitude for. I am expressing gratitude for ... And throughout the day, using it as an opportunity to open your day and using it as an opportunity to close your day. When you are receiving something that is life-giving, like a meal, using it as an opportunity. So part of spiritual practice is the practice of gratitude, is the practice of saying thank you to whatever energies have made something beautiful, enjoyable, helpful, nourishing, supportive in your journey. And what I think it does is it helps us break out of the story of individualism. It helps us break out of the notion that we're doing it by ourselves, that we somehow are the ones who are coordinating this, and we somehow are the ones that are making the thing happen. We're not the ones that are making the thing happen, that it is happening in conjunction with us, that is happening in support of us. We are co-creating the world, which means we are not alone in the world, which means that there are other things that are offering us support. And what does it look like to give appreciation and gratitude for the other things that are offering us support? That to me is such a fundamental, foundational aspect of a spiritual practice. Because spirituality acknowledges that we're not here doing this by ourselves. It flies in the face of individualism, which is one of the cornerstones of Western capitalist, white supremacist, heteronormative hegemony. So if you want to know an easy way to begin to interrupt some of these systems, gratitude. Powerful way to do that. And so prayer and gratitude became a foundational part of my life, and 12-step programs absolutely sort of supported and helped me continue to express those in a ritualized way. So that was sort of some of the beginning of my practices. And by this time I had left church. I found the inconsistencies to be too much to reckon with. It felt very clear to me. I was like, the same people who I think create the harm and violence in society are the same people who translated these words to utilize them for domination and oppression. And so I just can't co-sign that. And so I found myself really resistant to organized religion in that way. But I still felt a deep connection and resonance with God. And so I think 12-step programs were the way in which I still stayed connected to God, even though I wasn't in the church. After 12-step, therapy. Therapy. And I just so happened, and I say just so happened, and I don't really believe things just so happen. I believe life happens on purpose with radical love in service of our highest good. And with that belief, I ended up with a therapist who was a Buddhist practitioner since she was a teenager. And at this point, she was in her 50s when she became a therapist. Shout out Dr. Jocelyn Bronte, my therapist for the last 13 years, nonstop. And I didn't know at the time that my therapist did a lot of focus work around helping people awaken in the ways in which Buddhism talks about awakening, which is when the illusion of separation falls away and we return to a state of pure awareness and unification with awareness. Drop into source, right? And so, in my particular cosmological worldview, source is God. It is the essence of God. It is touching the essence of God. Awareness is touching the essence of God. The void is touching the essence of God. When I talk about the universe, I'm talking about the essence of God. I'm talking about the point from whence all other points come, and that energetic, vibrational frequency, which I define as God, and I think people can define as whatever they feel comfortable defining it as. But my therapist was helping me deal with the trauma that was keeping me separated from access to that part of myself, from the divine in me that has the ability to connect. And so therapy was a massive part of my practice. All these things sort of came right around the same time. So 12-step happened for many, many years on and off from 2002. And then I started seeing my therapist in about 2011, which was the same time that I founded The Body Is Not an Apology. And actually, I founded The Body Is Not an Apology in February 9th of 2011. And I started seeing my therapist in March of 2011. So it was this very quick, basically it felt like life was saying, oh, you're going to need all these tools at once. You're going to need all these things to support these other things. Because The Body Is Not an Apology was deeply spiritual work. It was just spiritual work starting from the location of the body. But it was very clearly deep spiritual work for me. And so much of what I was doing was about learning how to be with this deep spiritual work. And so if you all recall, anybody who has read The Body Is Not an Apology or followed our work, one of the first things we developed was 10 tools for radical self-love. And the 10 tools for radical self-love always included practices that helped to ground some of the teachings of radical self-love. And so one of the 10 tools was meditation with a mantra. And again, these tools sort of came through me the same way The Body Is Not an Apology came through me. And so I began a meditation practice. Actually, the first time I began a meditation practice was about 2009 is when I began. It's also when I first went vegetarian. And I didn't know it was a preview of 10 years later what would become a far more intense and intentional part of my life. But the original request was to go vegetarian. I was just directed. It sort of just came through the way that messages come through, but I didn't understand then that that's what was happening. So I was directed to go vegetarian and to start meditating. And so I would just take 15 minutes out of the day and I would just sit in silence. And actually, I'm sorry, I'm treating those like they happened in that order. What happened was I was told to start meditating. And I started meditating. And in my meditation, I was told to go vegetarian. I remember one time I was on a family vacation with a dear sister of mine at the time and her children, Gail Danley, and her kids. And we'd gone to Mount Rushmore. We had driven across the country. We drove through the Badlands, South Dakota, North Dakota. And we were at Mount Rushmore. And I stopped to meditate on the Lakota, part of the Lakota land. And I just meditated for 15 minutes. I just sat there and meditated. And that's when I got the message to go vegetarian. And so, in terms of practices, what I'm trying to sort of establish for you in the ways that it worked for me was that first, I was predisposed to a certain level of spirituality because I grew up in the church. But if you didn't grow up with that, what I'm proposing is that the first entrance is gratitude practice. That it's the first location of stopping and pausing and then being intentional about something, right? That is beyond just you as an individual. That's what a gratitude practice is. And prayer, again, gets to not be specifically directed at God, if that is not your orientation, but it is an understanding that there is energy that is beyond you. You don't have the ability to make a tree. You could receive a seed, right? Like you could receive a seed and plant a tree, which means you could steward the creation of a tree, but you don't have the ability to create it. Right? Which means there's something above you. There's something else that makes stuff that ain't you. You don't have the ability to make an ocean. Right? You don't have the ability to start all of life. You could start some, and there is some life that you could start, but you don't have the ability to start all of life, which means that there are other things at play. Right? So this is for folks who don't have an orientation toward God. My invitation is that there is an orientation toward the divine that you can step into, and that orientation is about acknowledging that there are forces greater than you, meaning that they can do things you can't do, right? And greater doesn't mean better. Greater doesn't, let's deconceptualize hierarchy in the ways that we've been oriented toward it. It doesn't mean better, but it does mean that there are energies that have capacities you do not. And what does it look like to acknowledge that? And then to acknowledge that you have a relationship to that. You don't have the ability to make an acorn, right? You don't have the ability to create that from seed, right? But should that acorn grow into a tree, that then is one of the essential aspects that provides oxygen for you to live, which means that that energy is part of your survival. So what does it look like to be in the practice of expressing gratitude for that? Boom. So then a meditation practice came after that. So we had a gratitude practice first, then we had a prayer practice, then a meditation practice came, right? And that meditation practice was about just getting quiet. One of the things that I heard was like, prayer is how you ask the question, and meditation is how you listen for the answer. And I really loved it. I can't remember who said it, so shout out to whoever you were who said that. I'm thinking of Ebony Janice telling us to cite our sources, and I'm like, I can't remember where the source was, but I can tell you it wasn't mine, so if somebody knows where it came from, let me know. So yeah, it was this invitation to explore and hear what life was trying to say to me when I got quiet. When I was able to stop all this mind chatter that was happening all the time, I could get quiet enough to hear what life was trying to say to me. And so meditation really helped me begin that practice. And then therapy allowed me to get quiet enough. Like, part of the reason that meditation is difficult is because we have so much mind chatter. And so much of the mind chatter is a function of our untended to trauma. Part of what we are ruminating on are the things that we've been ruminating on because they are pain points that haven't been dealt with. They are energies that we have suppressed. They are things that we have pushed down inside of us that then are constantly trying to come up through our thoughts or through our actions. But if we actually go and tend to them, we create energetic spaciousness. And inside of that energetic spaciousness, we can hear things that are beyond us. So one of the things that I always say is feeling is the access to our spiritual wisdom, because our emotions allow us to understand what inside of us has not been tended to. Our feelings are letting us know that something has happened, right? That activates something inside of us. And generally, that activation is a function, not all the time, but oftentimes, of something that is untended in us. And once we heal it, once we feel it and heal it, we create energetic spaciousness, which means we are a clearer channel for the divine in the form of trees, in the form of bees, in the form of oceans, in the form of energies that are beyond this realm to communicate with us. Because we're not so full of our own shit, quite literally. And so therapy is an incredibly important part of my healing journey that allowed me greater access to the spiritual realm and to spiritual practice. And what's true is, after therapy, after I began therapy and began sort of clearing some of these really old stories, there was a culminating point, and you all have heard me talk about this if you've listened to me in other platforms, and I haven't done a full podcast episode about the collapse of 2020, and I imagine that I will indeed do a full podcast episode on my own platform detailing the unfolding of that experience, of my awakening experience. But what I can say is that many of my practices sort of got formalized and concretized during that time. And some of the ones that were the most important to me during that time were, I already had a tarot practice. I got my first oracle deck, the Osho Zen Tarot, and I got that when I got my dog. When I got Anastasia, and the Osho Zen Tarot deck came at the same time, which means that they both came in 2008. So that was the first time I bought a deck, and I found that deck to be really interesting. It was the only one I had. And then maybe around 2013, I bought another deck, the Ghetto Tarot, and that was my first sort of using the archetypes of the tarot. And then I sort of started becoming a collector of decks, and I found them to be interesting. They would just sort of call to me. And every once and again, I would do a reading. It was certainly not any kind of regular practice. And the benefit of tarot is not that it tells you anything you don't know. It tells you your energy. And I think what ultimately I want to say about all these practices is that they are practices of understanding energy. Our own energy. We are energetic beings. I have said this numerous amounts of times. If you're standing someplace and somebody walks up behind you, you oftentimes will know that someone's behind you. Why? Because you feel their energy. You have had someone whose energy you didn't like. You might not have even known them. They walked in the room and you could feel their energetic imprint. We are energetic beings, and our energy goes out before us. Before you, before your thoughts, before your words, before your actions, there is the energetic presence of something. And so part of what these tools offer us is the ability to strengthen our sensory abilities, our energetic literacy. You know, I was talking to my therapist about this one time, and you all may have heard me mention my hives, our energetic information. They very much tell me when it's time to transition something, to change something. I'm in an energy that my body doesn't like or wants shifted. It like my hives are talking to me. And what I realized was that my hives were presentient. They show up before I have knowledge of whatever it is that they're indicating. They show up first. And it's because they're responding to the energetic field of something before it happens. Like psychic hives. And my therapist was like, right, I imagine that before we developed all these technologies, in order to function, like you had to have heightened sensory awareness. You had to be able to sense if a saber-toothed tiger, or a wild animal was in your vicinity. You had to be able to sense if, one, to survive it, but also if you were hunting, right? There were ways in which our sensory abilities were far more heightened before technology dulled them and then made us over reliant on technological sensory abilities rather than our innate sensory abilities. And our sensory abilities are just about actually being able to understand and move with and detect and navigate energy. In tarot, is the cards give you indications of energies, the dynamics of certain kinds of energies that we understand: romantic energy, the energy of letting something go, the energy of being in our full power, the energy of like feeling fertile and abundant, right? All of these archetypes in tarot cards are speaking to energy. And when we do a tarot reading, what we're doing is saying, tell me the energy of these areas. And it's your energy. But here's what's also true is we're not separate. We're connected. So it is possible to be inside the energies of other people because we're all connected. When I started using tarot, I would just be asking questions about, something I wanted to know. But what is true about, I will offer certainly about tarot and astrology as two of the tools in my tool belt, is that they can all become things that make us over reliant on external things. Again, it's just reading your energy, and you have the ability to connect to your own energy. You do not need cards to tell you your energy. You could take that same question into meditation and prayer and get quiet and get the same answers. Promise you. But it's a helpful tool to begin learning how to experience and be with energy. And so when the great collapse happened in 2020, the first thing that I did was I prayed, and then I picked up a djembe drum that was in my house, and I called on my ancestors. And I think that this is a really interesting piece, is that my first instinct was to call on my ancestors. I was in such pain and felt such devastation at the collapse of my whole life, like really quickly, that the only thing that I knew to do was to call on the energies that were above me. And I knew that there were energies above me. I knew that my ancestors, I knew that my mother and my grandmother and my great grandmother, the women of power and intentionality and deep love for me, that I knew they had to be holding me down. Like I knew that was the only way we was getting out of this. And I was, in a house alone, in lockdown by myself. And so I knew that there had to be something else that was going to support me through this time, because physical human contact wasn't going to be it. And so I began to really rely on and lean into ancestors and spirit guides and angels. And I was like, oh, there's got to be a whole other team of things working here if I'm supposed to survive this. and there was. And those energies began being very present for me. And so the other practice is ancestor veneration. And there are many, 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 many spiritual practices and ideologies and orientations that utilize ancestor veneration, which is simply that those who have gone on before us have wisdom for us. They have knowledge. They have things that they gathered in the earthly realm that are clearer and more understandable in the spiritual realm, and they desire to impart that information to us. And in so much as we decide to be in an intentional relationship with them, we can receive that information. And so I knew sort of intrinsically to call on my ancestors when it was all feeling like it was collapsing. And so I did. I called on my ancestors, and it was beautiful, powerful, incredible. All of a sudden, I had a power to navigate the moment that I didn't have before. And then after that, I began a daily tarot practice. I didn't know why I was doing this, y'all, but it was what was coming through, it was what was being led. And so I began to meditate daily and do a daily tarot practice. And it was like a 2-hour tarot practice. And what I realized was like, I was learning how to interpret energy. That's what tarot was giving me, was like a tool set to interpret energy. So it was a very big part of my practice for many years. And like I said, was practicing doing self readings like 2 hours a day, and then also doing readings for others. And astrology was sort of coming into the mix, but was not fully there. And so by this point, my practices are a gratitude practice. My practices are daily meditation practice. My practices are a tarot practice. My practices are a prayer and ancestor veneration practice. And part of my ancestor veneration practice involved creating altars for my ancestors, which again is like the invitation to bring intentionality to the energetic relationship you are cultivating. And we do this all the time, whether we realize it or not, right? Like we have the space in the room where you have the photos of the people who you really loved who've gone on, or you have the really special thing that someone gave you and it's sitting over here in a special place. Those are altars. That is altar creation. And so the invitation is to be intentional, right? To cultivate that space intentionally. And so now in my home, there are various altars. There are spiritual altars. There are altars for my ancestors. There are remembrance altars for our friends and loved ones who have gone on. There are altars for beauty and creativity and books, and like libraries are altars to books, right? Altars to learning. You ever be in a book nook and you've like, it's beautiful and there's a beautiful little chair and then there's a flower. Like the space was cultivated intentionally for a specific sort of activity of what I would call reverence, an altar. And I say that to sort of demystify these practices that we actually engage in all the time, but we don't treat them sacredly, although they are sacred. There's a part of us that knows they're sacred, and so there's a part of us that is engaging that, but we're not allowing it to fully integrate. We're not allowing ourselves to fully understand the context, to just go there 100%, right? To be like 100% 10 toes down. I'm gonna make an altar rather than like I'm gonna play around with it because it's calling through me, but I'm so indoctrinated into this system that tells me that I shouldn't take this seriously, or that it's bad or it's wrong or all these other things. It's an invitation to do it with intention and do it with sacred focus. And that's what elevates it to its highest energetic possibility, right? These ancestor altars that I had an altar at the time in the center of my house, and that altar included an ancestor to my altar to my child self. It was also where I did my readings at. It was a big, and maybe I'll share a photo in Patreon. If you're on Patreon, I'll share a photo of my altar during this 2020, during the Great Collapse, and I'll tell the story of it because it's a pretty cool story. So, and land ritual and land and water rituals. And again, all of this, y'all, just came through me. I was being directed. These were the practices that I was told to do through my spiritual guidance, because I called on them and said, please help me. And then they were like, say less. And then they had very specific things that they wanted from me. And so there was land and water ritual. There was land ritual around making offerings to the land that I was on, to clear energies that had been there that were no longer serving me. There were offerings to open up pathways. And I've had this for a while. Again, like I said, back in 2010 and 2011, when the Body is Mind Apology first started, I had a project called a RUHCUS project, RUHCUS, Radically Unapologetic Healing Challenge for Us. And it was a healing and transformational challenge that I had developed early on. And I had transformation altars in my house. Someone had given me a bottle of water. The bottle said love. And then the back of it had all these things you could love: travel, love flowers, love food, love friends, like all of these things. And I would pour water in that bottle and leave it on the altar. And then I would say my prayers there at night, and I would drink from my love bottle. So again, these were just directed through me, right? It was not, I had to go someplace and study this thing. I think that's what I'm trying to convey to y'all. I didn't go someplace and study something. And for some folks, that's good and useful and necessary. And that is also part of my journey. But at the time, I was letting myself be guided to the expressions that wanted to come through me. RUHCUS as a healing project involved first an honoring and acceptance ceremony. It first involved saying, what is this thing I'm grappling with? And how do I first give love and honor to the creation of it in me? Understanding that it was obviously here to teach me something. And can I have a relationship, a loving relationship to this difficult thing as I ask to transform it, right? And then 30-day ritual of being in the practice of a new belief and creating an affirmation. So these are the, like, when people say, like, what's your practice? It's been all the practices, all the practices, all the tools over time, and trusting yourself that you have access to this, you know, like this can come through you. And so following that instinct in you that says, oh, I want to explore this, following that instinct, y'all, letting yourself follow it. Hey, you, hey, you, hey, you, hey, you, hey, you, hey, you, and then I think I want to talk lastly. So we had tarot and then land rituals, water rituals, and these don't have to be, let yourself be guided. Let yourself be guided. Go to a body of water and then ask it, what can I give you? You know, I went to a tree once and I said, what do you want? And the tree said, your grief. And I knew that I was just supposed to water that tree with my tears. And that was the ritual. That was the practice. And I knew that because I was willing to ask. So part of what this means is that you have to ask questions that are out of your normative experience. You have to ask questions that presume that there is wisdom and knowledge in all of life, and that it's actually just waiting for you to ask it. That tree is waiting for you to ask it. That flower is waiting for you to ask it. That ocean is waiting for you to ask it, right? Everything has information for us. And so I think orienting it from that location can be helpful. In 2022 is when I began sort of my deep study of astrology, which absolutely is a deep part of my spiritual practice, because my natal chart has key information for how I can be in alignment with my own spiritual evolution and what path is the easiest path. What is life asking me to do to have a greater alignment with what my soul came here to do? How do I continue to move with less energetic resistance towards what my soul came here to do? And astrology has been a massive tool for that. But I think the challenge is, the invitation is, that we use astrology to do 3D shit. Tell me how to find a partner. When can I look for my best job? You know, like we're using it to navigate this 3D world. And I would offer that it is an incredible spiritual tool if we ask the questions of our chart that are about transcending the material world and becoming more and more aligned with our spiritual selves and what our souls came here to do. And one of the things I've been saying in my readings lately is there's Sonya the personality, and then there's my soul. And the space between those things is called suffering. And the goal, my intention in the use of astrology, is to shrink the space between Sonya's personality and my soul, such that there's less and less and less suffering and greater alignment. That's the goal. And so astrology has been a powerful tool. I use less tarot, in part because, you know, astrology and tarot, both I've had to have taken breaks from because I was over reliant on them and it was getting me to not listen. It was like, actually, you know this information, and right now you're just pretending like the only way you can access it is through these cards, or you're pretending like the only way you can access it is through this transit that's coming up. And that's not true. And so we're going to pull back from that. And so Tarot has very much fallen away. I read very infrequently these days. And astrology, I stopped looking at the daily transits. I know when a transit is happening because I feel it. And I can generally feel it and tell you what planets are moving because they have energetic imprints that I am very sensitive to now. So I know when something's moving. But needing to know them in advance doesn't serve me. For other people, it's helpful. When I know too many things in advance, I can start to ruminate and then try to control the outcomes or fret about how I think it's going to play out. And I forget that I actually have power and co-creation skills. And so we don't do that anymore. I think the last thing that I want to say about my own practices and the process of creating practices, and that really is what's true. I have been on a pathless path for most, like I got sort of jump started into Christianity and then ended up with a 13-year relationship with a Buddhist teacher / my therapist, and have touched on many other modalities since then. And I am not here to tell you which modality is right for you. You may be called to a path that is specific. What I can offer is that getting quiet enough to listen to your own inner knowing, getting quiet enough to listen to all of the offerings of life that give us information, and then expressing gratitude and love are some of the key foundational ways to begin to transform your life. It changes what you resonate with and what resonates with you. And when we change what we resonate with and what resonates with us, we open different doors. New possibilities become available to us because we have different locations we're looking in. It really is about our resonance. I have spent time with archangels, spirit guides, like all of those things. And, in my sort of cosmological view has space for all of that. But the consistent, regular practice of meditation, prayer, gratitude, and what I've moved into recently, which has been incredibly helpful, is movement-based practice. It makes me understand why yoga is such a powerful spiritual tool, because so much of what we're being asked to move is lodged in our bodies. We're seeing more and more research around this, embodiment. The Embodiment Institute is doing work around this, somatics work. People like Bessel van de Klerk, The Body Keeps the Score. There's a reason why I was called to do work around the body, and it's because so much of what it is we're working through and trying to understand is in our bodies. And so there's a real invitation to let ourselves be in our bodies. And so I have a movement practice. I meditate, and then I stretch and intentionally unlock the energy that's in my body. And then I go into prayer. And that's my morning practice every single day. And at night, I have a movement practice, another stretch, movement, unlocking energy, and then prayer, and then bedtime. And I'm just now developing my nighttime practice, because it used to just be watch YouTube videos until I fell asleep. I was very good about how I awaken, but not so great about how I go to sleep at night. And so I'm actively working to change that now. All right, y'all. So that's Sonya's practices. And mostly I just want to impart to you to listen to yourself, to ask for guidance from wherever it is that you experience as sacred. Ask for guidance. And you'll receive it. I promise you will. And if you don't hear it on the first answer, keep listening, keep asking. It will come through. I hope this is helpful. I hope that whatever path you are forging for yourself, that it involves greater and greater relationship to your wholeness and your connectedness with everything else. Because until you know you're connected to everything else, then we aren't whole. Right? And the goal is for all of us to be whole. I will see you all in a couple of weeks. As always, please like, share, subscribe, tell 15, 25 good friends that they need to be listening to Mundane Miracles with Sonya Renee Taylor, because we are over here doing what? Collecting evidence that life is happening on purpose, with radical love, in service of our highest good, even when it sucks, especially when it sucks. I'm sending you all so much love. Mwah! Have an amazing rest of your week. Bye.
You think you are dying, but you are being born.
Mundane Miracles with Sonya Renee Taylor is produced by Sonya Renee Taylor, edited by Dr. Shannon Weber. Our opening music is Joy and Grief by Sean and Abigail Bingson of the Bingsons. Our closing song is Dying by the Bingsons. Join us in the ritual of collecting evidence by rating, commenting, and subscribing to Mundane Miracles on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can get early access to episodes and support our radical love work by becoming a member on Patreon at patreon.com/Sonya Renee Taylor. That's patreon.com/Sonya Renee Taylor.